Hello. Today I'd like to present you with an overview of 5G, the fifth generation technology for mobile telecommunications. So to give us a little bit of a background, as mentioned, it is the fifth generation. That's what 5G stands for. There have been four generations that have preceded it. Of course, there have been numerous technological advances along the way in between these generations. So the numbers you see on the right are not actually reflect the entire generation. But we started out with the first generation, which utilized frequency division multiple access. We were able to get speeds around 2.4 kilobits per second. This is when cell phones and cell phone technology was just in its infancy. We were still using analog communications. The phones were huge, and very few people actually had them. The once cell phones actually started getting more popular, and we started getting 2G, and which utilizes time division, multiple access, and we were able to get speeds at 64 kilobits per second, which was actually really fast back then. These were able to actually utilize digital communications, and text messaging became popular, and phones became much smaller. We then moved on to 3G, which utilized code division multiple access. With 3G, we saw this is about the time smartphones were really starting to catch on. This is when the mobile internet was starting to catch on. We were able to get speeds of 200 kilobits per second, which was significantly faster than the technologies before it. And we were starting, this is when we started having the internet at our fingertips, and we were getting used to having the internet at our fingertips. We have since then moved on to 4G. 4G has been out for a good 10 years now. It uses OFDMA, and with 4G we are able to, at least under ideal conditions, get speeds up to 100 megabits per second. Now, and that brings us to where we are now. Right now we are in the fifth generation, which utilizes massive MIMO, and we should be able to expect to get speeds with this technology around 10 gigabits per second, a good 10 times faster than with 4G. Now, speaking more about the speed, so 5G has 5G has been rolled out in a number of places in the US. So if you get yourself a 5G phone, because you will need a 5G phone, because it does utilize a different spectrum and uses different antenna setup, and it'll need a 5G chip. So, but if you get you a 5G phone and you go to a 5G city, you can actually expect to get speeds roughly 700 megabits per second to 2 gigabits per second, depending on where you're actually at in proximity to the tower, the base station, and other factors. Now, since then, we are hoping to be able to get 10 gigabits per second with this technology. We have gotten in labs speeds up to 20 gigabits per second, and we are, in theory, should be able to get speeds up to 70 gigabits per second with 5G technology, but we're not there yet. So when I say 5G, I'm actually talking about a collection of technologies and protocols that will need to be working together to actually bring it to full fruition. It is quite different than 4G as far as the spectrum it'll be utilizing and the technology it needs to take advantage of to actually utilize that spectrum. One of the reasons we haven't utilized that spectrum for this kind of thing before is because the technology had to come far enough for us to utilize that spectrum. So the technologies I'm going to talk about, of course, is the spectrum itself, millimeter wavelength, but also the cells that we'll need to utilize to actually use those wavelengths, the massive MIMO, which I've mentioned in the previous slide, the beamforming technology and the full duplex technology. So one of the first things, and you've probably already heard this via conspiracy theories and whatnot, is that 5G will be using an entirely different spectrum than what 4G is utilizing, but it's not causing any adverse health effects. We are still well below what is considered ionizing radiation. This is still in the gigahertz range. You know, the general consensus that ionizing radiation starts, around the ultraviolet range, which is petahertz. So we still got a ways to go. The 4G utilizes speeds from 2 gigahertz, not speeds, excuse me. It utilizes the frequency range between 2 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz. With 5G, we're going to be utilizing the frequency range between 24 gigahertz and 100 gigahertz. The actual spectrum in between is being used by the military. So there's a few advantages to using that spectrum and a few disadvantages to using that spectrum. One advantage is that we should be able to put more information since we're using a higher frequency. But one of the large disadvantages to using this spectrum, and one of the reasons we haven't really been utilizing it for this type of communications thus far, is because the range for these wavelengths is not nearly as good as the range for the the higher wavelengths, lower frequency that we were using previously with the 4G. So we're going to have to use a lot smaller cells and a lot more of them. So the cells, each individual, when we say a cell, we're talking about the area that one base station or tower is going to cover. It doesn't have to be a tower, but the base station. The base station will have on it a number of antenna arrays. Each one of these little square things that you're seeing in the picture on this tower is actually an array of antennas, not just a single antenna. The actual spectral efficiency with MIMO, with massive MIMO, improves as the number of antennas goes up. Each one of these little boxes probably has 64 antennas in it, but we can actually easily scale that up. And I know 128 and 256 antenna arrays are actually out there already. We're going to need a lot smaller antenna base stations and a lot more of them. The coverage is not nearly as good as I mentioned a few minutes ago. The coverage for one 4G tower roughly has a radius of 16 kilometers, which is pretty significant. By retrospect, the 5G base stations will only go about 300 meters, practically. Like you can actually get ranges better than that, depending on what literature you're looking at. You might see something like 500 meters, but for an actual solid 5G signal based on the technology we actually have on the field, based on what I've actually seen, doing research on this, the actual expected range is about 300 meters. To put it in perspective, a city block is on average around 200 meters. So we're talking about 1.5 city blocks. So you're going to have, one of these things, at a minimum of 3 blocks away, just to have full coverage on one street, one block. And that actually goes down if you lose line of sight. These wavelengths are actually much more easily absorbed by structures, trees, buildings, and even rain. So realistically, you're probably going to need one of these towers, at pretty much every street corner. So massive MIMO, which I mentioned before, stands for multiple input, multiple output. It is massive because there are other versions of it, like single use MIMO or single user MIMO, excuse me, that it can be scaled down just to be used, but to actually get the advantage of it, it needs to be massive. The spectral efficiency actually increases with the number of antennas that we use and the number of users that we use. So we want to use a lot of them. That's what the massive is about. This is very scalable. We can utilize more antennas. This relies on software more than like FDMA is, so we can utilize it that way. Just to give you an idea, this is just a graph of the spectral efficiency, how it correlates with the number of receive antennas. Another technology which we'll be using in 5G is beamforming. So there are a few advantages to this because we are actually using antenna arrays, which is the primary difference between like just regular OFDMA and massive MIMO. The similar to like on your car, or you have your GPS and your GPS can tell where you are at relative to an actual array of satellites in space. Well, because we're actually going to be using antenna arrays, and these antenna arrays will be both at the base station and your cell phone, although your cell phone will naturally be using much fewer antennas because we want to keep those things small. But they will actually be able to use those arrays to triangulate the best path of communications between you and your base station. And now you may think that your signal is just going to naturally take the straight path to a base station, and it does, but there's actually a whole lot more going on there in reality. So your antenna and your base station with say 4G technology is actually omnidirectional. It's going out in all directions. So while it might be taking that straight path to your base station, it may also be taking any number of alternative paths as well, as it bounces off of buildings and streets and anything else. And that causes the base station to receive multiple signals. They're actually the same signals. Some of them might be degraded, some of them will have a lot more latency because it took a longer, more convoluted path to get to the base station. But that's something that the base stations have had to deal with. Now, with 5G technologies, we're going to actually be able to improve it though, because they'll actually essentially be able to home in on the best path and focus on that, which will conserve resources and improve latency for 5G. So lastly, I want to talk about full duplex. This is the last technology to help make 5G get those speeds that we're hoping to get. So with traditional communication schemes, like this FDMA, we've utilized different actual spectrums for the communication and the receive. So to keep the communication, or the uplink and the downlink communications from actually interfering with each other, as they will do, they are waves. But with other technologies, we like TDMA, we have them take turns. One of them will be transmitting at one point, next time, and then we'll receive, and then actually will take turns. But with 5G technology, we're planning on having them both do it at the same time. Like, we've gotten the technology now where we should be able to prevent the received signal from actually interfering with the transmit signal. And that will, of course, effectively double the bandwidth that we can utilize. So the impact, one notable impact that we're really excited about with 5G is impact it's going to have on autonomous driving. So right now, one of the problems with autonomous driving is the cars are only able to tell what the other cars are doing because of the sensors actually on those cars. They really can't communicate with each other, and it wouldn't be practical to have them communicate with each other with 4G. However, with 5G, it's going to have a lot more bandwidth and a lot more spectrum that should be able to make that more of a reality. And of course, the Internet of Things. There's more and more things that utilize the Internet these days. Now, a lot of those will be using the same spectrum that 4G is utilizing, but with 5G coming out, a lot of the things that are using 4G right now will actually be using the 5G spectrum. And as I mentioned way back at the beginning of this slideshow, this presentation, that you're probably not actually getting those 100 megabits per second speeds with your 4G LTE phone like you would expect to get. And part of that has to do a lot with just the number of users and the number of traffic that's actually using that spectrum that's sucking up your bandwidth. So whenever 5G comes out, we'll also have more bandwidth available, even though bandwidth is a finite resource for the Internet of Things and the 4G LTE stuff actually still using that spectrum. And of course, emerging technologies. We don't really know the full effect of how we can take advantage of this bandwidth yet. So, but as we know from history, once it's actually available, we'll probably start seeing some applications come out for it. Okay, and I just want to take a few minutes to talk about the market a little bit, because I can't recommend enough that if you haven't started investing, that you do so. The sooner you start, the better. It's never been easier. There is an app for that. These are all commissionless. These are all commissionless traders. So that you're seeing listed, and you can just download their app and start trading. My favorite stock that you'll see on here is Nokia. Nokia used to make phones. That's what you probably know them for, and they were indestructible. They have since moved on to infrastructure, and they are very cheap for a share price. It's also probably the most controversial one on here. And I want to point out that I'm not a professional when it comes to the stock market by any means, but I still invest, and I would encourage anybody else to do so. Also, of course, Apple is a solid investment. I think these are all pretty solid investments as far as the long term is concerned. NXP Semiconductors over there in the chip section. So I mentioned autonomous driving. They're the ones that are actually going to be making some of those chips for those cars. That being said, I would actually avoid the carriers for right now. And so to summarize, there are some pros and some cons to 5G technology. The pros, we're going to have a lot more improved speed, a lot more reduced latency. There are going to be smaller base stations, and it's a lot more scalable than what 4G LTE was. Some of the cons, the range is very limited compared to 4G LTE, so it's going to be a while before we have all the coverage that we do right now for 4G. The hardware, it does have to be new. You're going to have to, you can't utilize it with your 4G phone. You're going to have a new 5G phone, and they're going to have 5G base stations in your area. The infrastructure, This is, again, it's going to take a lot more base stations than what we previously have. It's going to be a lot more data centers too than what we previously had to handle all that new bandwidth. More fiber, more routers, more switches. The and the it's limited in terms of in structures. The millimeter wavelengths that we're utilizing for 5G are much more easily absorbed by just the atmosphere or buildings, and even of course rain. That's why I have rain fade there. So if you got a satellite and it rains heavy and you lose your picture, that's going to happen with 5G as well. Unfortunately, your range is going to go down quite a bit if there's a heavy rain outside. And we'll be working on improving those technologies as time goes on, but it's something we'll have to deal with. And that concludes the presentation.